Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honoured to be here today to talk on one of my pet subjects. I hope to show some new light on iron making in the early 19th century compared with art. In doing this, it may be just a glimmer, hence the gas lamp. There are various ways of looking at pictures, and here I continue the idea of gaslighting. The Ronson picture, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that one, but we can see there's a very different treatment on the left compared to the treatment on the right. And the treatment on the right, of course, is a much more of a drawing, an engineering drawing, than the comical one on the left-hand side. In taking the period that we're looking at today, I've taken two images here. One of the Institution of South Wales Engineers, which was founded in 1857, at just that time when the iron industry was moving more towards Bessemer steel, as shown on the right. This was sad. It was to transform South Wales, of course, and really would lead to the decline of the South Wales iron industry with the introduction of Bessemer steel. So that gives some idea of why the bracket I've taken, which is the early 19th century, and why I've extended it only up until roughly the 1850s. Now, art and industry. How on earth can we compare art with industry? In doing this, I take the idea of using industrial archaeology as a tool, and this tool gives us the background in which we can look at images. And the images can be very tampered with by the artist. He can either be persuaded by his own particular temperament, or he can be, of course, persuaded by his patron. But the area I've chosen, and hopefully this will show all right, is from Laun, which you had a lecture on some years ago. It's now a World Heritage Site, right across the outcrop of the South Wales coalfield as far as Merthyr Tydfil. Your General Secretary, our General Secretary, sadly said, what a shame I wasn't including Swansea. But it was on this rim of the South Wales coalfield that industry was founded, mainly because the raw materials needed for iron making outcropped along this northern edge from Laun across to Merthyr Tydfil, where there were four ironworks, as you probably know: Cyfarthfa, Dowlas, Penydarren and Plymouth. I shall only be briefly dealing with these. So in fact we have an iron industry which was a hinterland industry. It was very removed from the ports of Newport and Cardiff. Well, in comparing these two approaches, I've taken two well-known pictures, and I should here acknowledge that in using the term new light, I mean literally new light. Many of the images you'll see today will probably be familiar to you, and it's just the different way I've looked at them, rather than looking at them in the traditional way. So in the top one we have the well-known Sublime artist of a picture of the Bedlam furnaces at Coalbrookdale, and in the bottom one we have the Paul Sanby Munn one, which is exactly the same subject but treated in a different way. The top one, I might say, is the industrial sublime. The bottom one I would think of in terms of the picturesque. So perhaps it would rather depend on the artist's view of these industries. Let us say that the iron masters, those that were putting the money into the iron industry, would maybe think more in terms of the bottom one, that it was something that was beautiful rather than something which was over-challenging. Possibly those who were anti-industry would think in terms of the top one. We won't go too far into this debate, but we'll just say that Edmund Burke, of course, was the protagonist mainly of the industry being the sublime, and if we think in terms of Gilpin, we would be looking at the Potham illustration. I hope I'm not teaching my grandmother and grandfather too much, but I think it's necessary that you have some understanding of how iron making actually took place. And I've split this lecture really into two parts. The primary manufacture of iron, which is in a blast furnace, and the secondary manufacture of iron, which took place in the forge. I'm not dealing, I hope you've gathered, I will not be dealing with steel making in the terms of Bessemer steel. Very simply, the blast furnace was built into a bank. At some stage it was open-topped in most of the period we're dealing with. The raw materials of iron ore, coal and limestone were charged in a tap by a barrow, descended in the furnace in this cross-section that we see, descended down, it expanded into the middle part, known as the boshes. It began to melt and then went down to the bottom where around 7 and 8 the iron was withdrawn, and at 7 the waste was withdrawn, the slag. Both of these things we will be seeing later on with other images. 10 was an important part because this was a large quantities of air were needed to help, let's say in simple terms, in the combustion, to cause the chemical reactions. So these required blowing engines, big blowing engines. So the location of the iron industry was also dependent, to a large extent, on water power at this early time, ultimately steam power. Well, my first example really is by way of illustrating how we're going to use the sources we have. The first one is of Glenavon Ironworks, perhaps known to you, as I was saying earlier, as now a World Heritage Site. And this was the view of the ironworks as drawn by Richard Colt-Hoare. Richard Colt-Hoare and Archdeacon William Cox went on a tour of Monmouthshire and were surprised by this remarkable view. The bottom slide, or bottom part of this slide, shows the ironworks today, now a World Heritage Site, as we were saying, and we can see there are certain comparisons, so that archaeologically we have some sort of basis for comparison. Over here, hopefully this will work, on the left-hand side, we can see 3 furnaces, 1, 2 and 3, and then below there that compares roughly with this area here, with the cast houses, not as we see them in this 1799 view, but similar nevertheless, certainly cited the footprint on the footprint. Over to the right, we have 2 other furnaces which were built later. So the treatment of this particular view would be seen probably by Colt-Hoare as one surprise, but also he would compare it perhaps to the aesthetics of the day. He says, for instance, or Cox writes of this, the whole is a busy scene, the fire and thick volumes of smoke occasionally bursting forth from the furnaces, the many cottages and habitations disposed all around together, with the very picturesque forms of the buildings being very irregular, massive and decisive in their forms. Now, that is typical picturesque language, and that's the way he saw it, and that's the way he wrote it. This next slide shows the area we've been dealing with, and the spot from which it is drawn. This time we're looking at a plan of 1814, and we can see very simply that 4 and 5, I hope you can see 4 and 5, had been built since the last one. So we had 1, 2 and 3, we had in front, we have the cast houses there, and this is the viewpoint. If we take the bottom part, this is an aerial view of the site today. This area, sorry, I've done the wrong thing, I do overdo that eventually, but there we are. So the viewpoint is the viewpoint that Cold Hall drew it from, and the viewpoint from which it was described by Archdeacon Cox. So in the middle here we've got an area here called Stack Row. So the people lived very close to their works, and that's partly the description that we have from Archdeacon Cox. Now this was transformed for the book from the one we saw earlier. Just go back to that top one there, 4. That was transformed, this sepia wash drawing was transformed into an engraving by William Byrne. Probably some of you know of him, his work as an engraver. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to capture that same spirit which we heard in the account. So his ideas are in a sense formed by the description. So we not only have the image, but we also have the description by Archdeacon Cox. He taps in little tiny extra little pieces like this. Here we have got a drift mine driven up into the outcrop, which is also described, try to get rid of that, also described in these terms. He describes it, he talks about cars, which he really means trams or wagons, emerging and then disappearing in the subterranean passages of the rock, form a singular and animated picture, not unlike the moving pictures in a camera obscura. Now that camera obscura is typical again of this sublime, this picturesque language. Camera obscura, something vaguely seen, not exactly as it was, but formulating in people's minds the idea of the sublime. Well, we move on now to another area. This one is in the Clydach, and I probably might be better if I just jump back to this one. And the Clydach is rather out of the way. It's this little area here, not on the outcrop itself, but nevertheless close to the raw materials. Started as an ironworks before coke came in, started as an ironworks when charcoal was being there. It's like a typical bit of industrial inertia. The site went on in use once it went into coke. The site itself is now again a wonderful listed building, and I try to show on the two sides here this view of the ironworks here. So we're looking at the side view rather differently to at Glenavon. We can see the cast house where the pigs, that's the molten iron, was cast into these pig-like shapes. And then behind it here, we've got a launder, which is carrying water to a water-powered wheel, which is working the bellows, which was actually creating the blast. This was again this was drawn by Peter Richard Hall, who was a relative of that banking firm that drew the Glenavon ironworks. And he went on a tour like most gentlemen did, particularly, as you'll know, during that time when the French wars were in place and people were forced to find their own sublime and their own picturesque, because they couldn't go on their tour on the continent. Down here we have both these are unpublished actually. Down here we have the view, I hope you can see it, of the ironworks here from the other side. So that's the same ironworks as that one there. And also, I hope you can see, it hasn't come out quite as well as I hope, but you can see the launder, the water course being carried on stilts to power the water in there. To us, I think, as we look at this, both these now, we see these in terms of being really quite attractive pictures. The nature of the landscape. Those of you I know Abergavenny. You can see the Sugarloaf there in the background, a little town of Abergavenny down in the bottom there, and the Usk coming down there, for those of you that know the area. We also find a certain amount of detachment of the iron making process. Here we can see the rolling going on. You can just see the very, very large water wheel which powered the rolling mills, which we shall turn to later. But not everybody saw this in quite the same way. It was seen by another reverend gentleman. They all seem to have so much time on their hands. Archdeacon Henry Thomas Payne's censure. There are few places, describing its actual ironworks, there are few places more replete with romantic scenery than the little vale of Clydach. Though of late years, this is the important thing, the exertions of art, meaning industry of course, had considerably encroached upon the wild quality of nature. Those only who will remember the bold beauties which she presented before the subjugation by that man can have any conception of the great changes which have been effected. So we have two different views. We have the view of Archdeacon Cox, who describes it all as very picturesque, same sort of thing, and then we have the Archdeacon Payne, who's saying it's really rather horrible. So we're now getting, I hope, to the idea that there are different ways of looking at scenery. Now, this is a well-known picture to those of us interested in such matters of Rumney Ironworks, which is a few valleys over. Just trying to, that's better. Moving here to where we are. So we're now at Rumney. So we moved from Glenavon to Clydach and now to Rumney. Forgive my pronunciation, but most people seem to call it Clydach, although I know it should be something like Clydach. But this is the Rumney Valley, a fair way over in our little journey. And I will come back to that. So Rumney, very big ironworks, founded in the 1800s. And this is a panorama, of course. Here we've got a looming hill. Here we've got a rather pleasant little garden in the front. And here we've got a gardener working in it. We've got another ironworks here. But the important thing is that the artist has tried to hide, in a sense, industry. But there is this middle band of industry running along there. Here, you may be able to see the smoke coming from the open-topped blast furnaces, similar to Glenavon. And then over here, we've got the forges where the process known as puddling took place, and the conversion of pig iron into malleable iron. One or two things are of interest. We find here this rather strange thing like a Newtonian ball. And if we look closely at the furnaces, we'll be able to see that they are in an Egyptian manner. And even the blowing engine has got a minaret type tower for the discharge of gases. For some time it's doubted where this picture was taken, whether it was Rumney or not. It very obviously is Rumney, as can be seen by the next slide, which shows the three furnaces which were drawn up for an article, drawn up for publication following the submission of them to the Royal Academy in the 1820s. Intrinsically sublime Egyptian style, they've been called, and you can just see, not being an Egyptologist, I hope I've got the right place, but this is Dendera, is that correct? The type of temple, Egyptian temple. So they were really into fashion in their design of things. and it describes in the Royal Academy Summer Exhibitions of 1827, 1828, an iron manufactory now electing on an estate belonging to the Marquis of Bute by John McCulloch, Fellow of the Royal Society, 1773 to 1835. But also here, just go back, this little chap here, the ball, like a Newtonian ball, is puzzling. But you can see here it's been repainted, and I hope you can see a very distinctly Egyptian podium on which it sits. I puzzled about this for some time, how it was derived, and I'm guessing, and some of you will strongly disagree, I'm sure, that it may have come from John Martin's Mezzotint of 1827. Nice date, ties in very neatly. And the purpose of that ball was to actually hold air. It was a reservoir for air in this blowing process. This sort of discard of bits of rail and wheels is rather typical of that period, where they were trying to bring some sort of interest into it and detritus thrown about. In the distance you can see, I hope, that chimney, the minaret there going up, and beyond it, very, very faintly, you can see the forge area where the rolling took place. The other thing I wonder if, in fact, with the bottom part of this slide, we can see a well-known Mezzotint, Belshazzar's Feast, again by John Martin, 1826, and it's suspiciously gives one the feeling that these might have been based on blast furnaces, the pillars there. Maybe a bit far-fetched, but it's a nice idea. It's particularly interesting because, in fact, John Martin, I understand, but I haven't found a reference for it, that he actually did pass through Merthyr and therefore he came very close to Rumley. So it seems quite possible that he was actually influential in this. Now, I have not paid tribute in this paper to two sources that I've used. First of all, Francis Klingenger's Art in the Industrial Revolution, which really set me off in this quest. And the other is Peter Lord of the National Library of Wales, who's used these images. But I should have said earlier that he hasn't used these images in the way that I've used them. I have used them as tools alongside industrial archaeology. Klinginger, well, probably actually Sir Arthur Elton wrote this. He says, grandiose, describing this Egyptian idea, grandiose architectural fantasies influenced the style of many of the greatest engineering works of the day, which include the Egyptian nature, Brunel's suspension bridge over the Avon. So, you know, who am I to take argument with such scholars as those? Now, I'm going to go back just to these images here, which are not very clear. But it gives us an idea of how artists were thinking in similar ways. This top one is a sketch by Turner, which he made during his tour of South Wales. And you may just be able to see very similarities between the bottom one. This is a different treatment. We've got a pencil at the top, of course. In the bottom one, we've got a soft ground etching by John George Wood. John George Wood did a subscription copy of the Rivers and Vales of South Wales, Principal Rivers of Wales, in which he illustrated it like this. One good thing about these is that they are pretty accurate, because they are soft ground etchings, which meant he worked with a piece of paper on top of a sheet of copper, and as he drew with his pencil, it removed the mutton wax or whatever he was drawing through, so when he etched it out, you get a pretty faithful copy. But it's very similar to what to that which Turner did. You can see the furnaces there, I hope. The furnaces there. You can see the river, of course, the Taff coming down there. Very famous iron bridge, Pontycavnine Bridge, probably the earliest railway bridge in the world. And the cast houses, all very similar to Glenavon. But listen to this, this is not meant to offend anybody. Our friend William Byrne was trying to publish his book for a different, well, it was an expensive thing printed by subscription. So he was trying to appeal to the gentry. And he says, the whole is a busy scene, same sort of language. We start off with Cox's A Busy Scene. The fire and thick volumes of smokes, all that sort of thing comes into it. And then he then blasts off with this prevailing mode of building, adding to the known habits of the lower orders of the Welsh, forgive me, makes it unnecessary to mention its state with regard to cleanliness. Indeed, the enormous furnaces pouring forth incessant clouds of black smoke contribute their share towards the dirt and filth so generally observable throughout the place. So if we could go back to Glenavon and just compare that, the whole scene is busy, fire and thick volumes of smoke, occasional bursting forth from the furnaces, many cottages, habitations, same sort of thing, disposed all around together, very picturesque forms of the buildings, being very regular, massive and decisive. You know, so it's a rather different view. So we're getting different ideas coming about this sort of scene. And now to the sublime. Well-known view by George Childs. He did 3 lovely watercolours of Dowlas. Dowlas, one valley to the west of Rumley. And how accurate is this? You know, was he really just letting himself go, or was he accurate? Well, I think if we look at, say, that furnace there on the left, I hope you're familiar now with furnaces on the left, and this one here, an engineering drawing of one, also a Dowlas number 14 blast furnace, which actually ties in pretty well with that, or rather with that. We can see that they're probably quite accurate. Open-topped, the tapping part at the bottom of the furnace round here, and then 3 or 4 old-type furnaces on the other side of the valley. So they form a horseshoe going around the end of the Dowlais Brook. Some pretty interesting things here. Is he really being censorious, or is he painting an accurate picture? Or is he in love with the sublime? It's difficult to know. I've tried to find a source for these 3 pictures, one of which is here, but it doesn't. They seem to have come from British Steel, and they're now in the National Museum of Wales, not the National Library of Wales. Beautiful watercolours, some of the finest I've ever seen of this type of scenery. There are 1 or 2 little remarks here. You see a woman working, I think, there, filling a tram with coal, probably, or ready to take it to charge into a furnace. This was the time of the Chartists when this was painted. Perhaps there are some references to that. Anyway, the slide down here, if we can take that and now introduce another type of subject matter, which is the photograph, which I know it comes outside our period, but it is worth looking at it. And if you take this and you compare it with the previous one, you can see here it's a pretty accurate. That's an excellent representation. That ties in, and also, of course, we have the view. Here we are at the tapping part of the furnace here. Got all sorts of accretions, blast pipes, you know, adaptations been going on over the years. Basically a stone-built furnace, brace there to stop it falling apart between each campaign when it might have cooled off and cracked. And then we've got the channel here into these slag tubs. You can see these are cast iron. They would have taken the slag, and then the iron would have run there. See here a thing called a balling gun, which I won't go into. I mean a mud gun for sealing the furnace. And what's the photograph about? Well, is it one of pride? Is it one of censure? What's its purpose? Here we've got a wonderful picture of a gaffer standing to attention with his bowler hat, the foreman, and then you've got the rough and ready workers on either side. A gorgeous picture. Move on as quickly as I can, so I don't get into trouble, to the next process. So we've got our molten iron comes out of the furnace, cast into cast iron pigs, brittle cast iron. For the railways of the day, something had to take place. Cast iron was brittle, it wasn't good for railways, it just broke. Plateways were about at the time, L-shaped rails like that were around, but the wrought iron rail was going to rule the roost, and many of these rails came from Merthyr Tydfil particularly, and were sent all over the world. Well, the process used was that of puddling, and it was at Cyfarthfa. I think perhaps we'd better just go back very quickly to find that, so you'll know where Cyfarthfa is. Cyfarthfa is, these are the three principal ironworks of Merthyr Tydfil, and Cyfarthfa right over there in the west. Let's go back to that one. And here we are. Well, it's said that it was written that the secondary processes, that's my words, wrought or malleable iron, finally brought to perfection through the persistent efforts of Mr. Corchet of Cyfarthfa. Corchets of Cyfarthfa, a well-known name. In fact, it was Henry Corn, some of you may have come across his name, who in 1784, under Corchet's sponsorship, worked out this process. Very, very clever idea, reasonably simple. The idea was that if you heated the iron again in the presence of coke or coal, you would just put more carbon into it, which made it brittle. So he worked out the idea, really, of separating the iron from the coal. So it was a thing called a reverberatory furnace. The heat from this side, the coal burning, reflected down onto the pig iron on this side, and the gases were discharged through there. After this, it was taken and it was rolled into various shapes, particularly rails. Excuse me. So it's a little furnace, well, nothing like as big as the other. But the rolling required to get it into a billet, that means a sort of a shape where it could be worked and rolled, which we'll come to in a moment, needed to be hammered. And this is of Cyfarthfa, and in this we can see water power, a great big, what's known as the shroud, made of wrought iron, connecting with a flywheel, which is here. We can see a hammer there and a hammer on that side. And this is turned with little tappets, and those tappets would lift the hammer up and the hammer would drop down. So here we have Julius Caesar Ibbotson being very accurate, no doubt about that. Flywheel, that to maintain momentum, water power, hammers being lifted as the tappet goes by, drops down. Sorry, let's go back again. But the picture's got a certain treatment about it. We can see the hammerman with his team, with his heavy coat on. The shadow against the wall there. We can see this fellow bringing a billet from the puddling furnace, sort of going out and then coming back like an actor going off stage. So it's a really very wonderful picture from the point of view of the industrial archaeologist and the art historian. And so much of what I'm saying is that we look at Madonnas and we say Madonna this, Madonna that, you know, John the Baptist there holding this, we know who he is. But we don't look at pictures of industry, we just ignore them. We just take them as what they are. But they've got so much detail and so much iconography in them, that we don't bother to analyse. And I hope I'm trying to do that. I mean, even dear old Turner, in his sketchbook, you can see here the enormous there. You can just see that there's the flywheel. There's possibly the actual. It's got little gearing on it, little teeth in it for gearing. And over here we've got something very similar to what Ibbotson was trying to do. The shadow there. We've got the man there with taking it under the hammer. We can even see the tappets there. Very, very similar sort of picture. And Turner was there at roughly the same time that Julius Caesar Ibbotson was. I put this in for my guest today, John. You'll see there that Joseph White of Derby, very similar. The processes were similar. You can see there under the hammer, about to fall, the billet. But here, of course, we've got all sorts of, which we won't go into, but different sort of treatment. This is just a tool, really, to show a family, a man who's lost his sight, and so on. So it may be, I need to talk to John about this, but it seems, again, very censorious. Well, we're now still at Cyfarthfa, and this is by Penry Williams, and Penry Williams was the fellow who painted the one of Rumney. And we got all sorts of strange things here. We got almost a country estate here, you know, very faint in the distance, little animals running around. And then we've got over here a whopping great forge. Now, what is happening here? What is he trying to do? What he's trying to do is he's trying to say, I own all this. I'm a country gentleman on one side, but I'm also an industrial entrepreneur on the other. But if you could just hold that in your mind, you'll be able to see how the next picture fits in. First of all, it's painted from the Crawshay's house, which is a large mansion, which is still in Merthyr Tydfil. Very fine museum, worth going to. So he's looking down on his estate. A row of blast furnaces in the background there. Massive works by now, largest in the world by now. But the forge, where this secondary process went on. So he's looking down. And the next slide is actually looking in it. We're actually inside the furnace, inside the forge. And over here we've got the rolling, which is really rather like the old-fashioned mangle. So the iron is being taken, and by this chap here, the roller, one of the aristocrats, not the wrong thing, one of the aristocrats of the iron industry, he's taking it, passing it through the rolls. A chap on the other side is picking it up and passing it back again. So you might pass it 2 or 3 times. And over here, you can see now, I hope, there you've got the actual puddling furnace, and there, peeping out, just keeping an eye on his workers, you've got Cyfarthfa Castle, the home of the Crawshays, always an eye on them. And there's the chimney for the actual rolling mill. And there are descriptions, which are wonderful. This one comes actually out of our friend Wood, who did the rather nasty description. Some stirring liquid in a kind of oven. That's the puddling furnace. Others drawing heated masses along the ground, and others again carrying bars of red-hot iron, which as they pass through the rollers may be compared to the windings of so many fiery serpents, and to all this, the strong reflection of the fire upon the figures covered with the black dirt of the works. How interesting. If we look at what might have been an objective picture, and we look at this, how we got the dark here separating us, the viewer, from this nasty, horrible world in which industry goes on. Again, we have the detritus thrown around, bits of molten iron rolls, which we had a larger image you would be able to see. And here's the man himself. Here's the roller. So many of these images come out of Peter Lord's book, or books on the industrial wares, and I should pay tribute to that, but he hasn't used it as I would. So here is the roller. There he is. He would grasp the iron, pass it through these mangles, and because of the dangers, he would have goggles, as we can see. And it's very nice, actually, because he actually is named. It's giving him an identity, which does seem to be rather unusual. Well, we're coming now to another side of things. I should say that George Burrow described Cathedral rolling mills in this sort of mood. I saw streams of molten metal. I saw a long ductile piece of red-hot iron being operated upon. I saw millions of sparks flying about. I heard all kinds of dreadful sounds. The general effect was stunning. One's not quite sure. I mean, it may be that some of us might look at some pictures by Walter Sickert and be horrified by them, but they're somehow fascinating, as they were to him. Well, we come to this picture, which is, you may think, what on earth is he showing this for? We've got a gentleman, Samuel Humphrey, did well, and he's not sitting for his portrait like other people. He's got different attributes, and the attribute here is a furnace, a smallish one, a bit like the Clinic one. He's got gun dogs. He's got a gun. What's he doing? What's he trying to tell us? Well, the Humphreys were newly rich industrialists with aspirations towards being landed gentry. And if you want to be landed gentry, you don't lease mineral rights, as all the other ironmasters do. You marry the boss's daughter. And so Samuel did this by marrying the daughter of Sir Charles Morgan. You may have seen a programme with, what's his name, Rhys something, on television of Tredegar House. That's where Morgan held his money. So he married Sir Charles Morgan's daughter, Jane. And that gave him not only his iron, but he also, because he married the landowner's daughter, he also had the sporting rights. So he can very happily trot around with his dogs and his gun, shooting his grouse, which other ironmasters couldn't do. And there's slightly, those of you familiar with the Gainsborough Mr. and Mrs. Andrews may see at least some sort of references to this. Right, so as my period closes, that's about right, isn't it? As my period closes, while some estate ownership remained important, stocks and shares took on greater importance. The alternative being painted amidst grouse moors like this chap, Samuel Humphrey, or running a model farm, as the Crochet tried to do, was now through making a visual declaration of one's industrial buildings, as we saw with Guest, who was showing us the ironworks and the furnaces built into the bank with all the fire coming in. Thus, although subverted in part as agricultural, by the 1840s the ironmaster was declaring his empire not as an ennobled industrialist with local interests, but was beginning to show his interest with power at Westminster rather than the county. Hence, Guest became a member of Parliament rather than just a justice of the peace. Now, I think that's probably it.